Well, it's still the Easter season. It's Tuesday, 22 April 2025, and we're still celebrating Easter for several weeks in the correct tradition. Today, I want to mark the 40th anniversary of Richard A. Epstein's publication of Taking, Takings. The subtitle is Private Property and the Power of Eminent Domain. Richard A. Epstein, Harvard University Press. And I highly recommend this book for all advanced undergraduates and law, government, and philosophy graduate students. It's an essential book on constitutional law. It's one of the best books I've ever read on constitutional law. Richard A. Epstein. In celebration of the 40th anniversary of the publication of this book, 1985, we're going to be doing some transformative readings in order to help sell the book. I want to thank Harvard University Press for making this material available. Of course, I want to thank Richard A. Epstein for writing it. And we want to acknowledge um, that Richard Epstein is still active. I think he's about 82 or something like that. I don't know exactly how old he is. I did notice that he hasn't done an update on his podcast, The Libertarian, put out by Stanford. He hasn't put a new episode out since December of 2024. I was becoming concerned about his health, and I did want to have him on the podcast, but um, I know he's very busy. And I just noticed that he has a new episode of Law Talk out, which is the first one that has been done in 3 quarters. So I think the last one they did was third quarter 2024. And here it is, second quarter 2025. We had his co host John Yu on the podcast here. And I recommend Law Talk Podcast for you to find out more about Richard Epstein. Also, I think quite a few of the episodes going back a couple years are on the Libertarian are up. I would also recommend for historical purposes, they don't have very many episodes up still, but on Apple Podcasts, but you can access Reasonable Disagreements where he talks with Adam White. Now, Richard has been known to be wrong about a few things, but most of the time he's right. And on this issue of takings and private property, man, I can't think of a better person to introduce. Shoot, I would just say freaking American law, American constitutional statesmanship. I don't know if there's a better person um, for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to read. We're going to make a fair use of this. I'm going to read part of this over a series of episodes, and I'm going to highly suggest you buy the book yourself. Have it on your bookshelf. Throw Harvard University Press some business. Um, Good for them for publishing this. This is solid stuff, man. It's solid, solid stuff. Again, the book is called Takings, Private Property, and the Power of Eminent Domain, Richard A. Epstein. Let's get a taste of this. Chapter 1. We're going to make a fair use transformative reading. Chapter 1. This book is an extended essay about the proper relationship between the individual and the state. Can you think of a better way to begin a book than that? That's how he begins this book on constitutional law. The specific vehicle for examining this question is the eminent domain or takings clause of the Constitution, which provides, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. In the course of this study, I subject other constitutional provisions to examination as well, like the contract clause, for example. The problem to which the eminent domain clause is directed is that of political obligation and organization. What are the reasons for the formation of the state? I'm telling you, these first chapters are excellent introduction to American government. If you just wanted to use these first chapters in this book, Takings, Private Property and the Power of Eminent Domain, Harvard University Press. If you want to just use these first chapters to introduce American government in a semester-long class as a part of the reading, you could do a lot worse. I'm telling you, you could do a lot worse. In fact, next time I teach intro, I'm using it. I've already decided. The problem to which eminent domain clause is directed is that of political obligation and organization. What are the reasons for the formation of the state? What can the state demand of the individual citizens whom it both governs and represents? The simplest way to present the problem is to draw two pies. See the figure on the next page. Let's keep going. The first of these pies, I'm on page 3, represents the situation in a world without effective government control. Each individual is endowed, according to the natural rights tradition, with certain individual rights. Okay, I told you I'm gonna do a fair use. So I'm gonna do a transformative reading. I'm gonna show you something in both Richard and I's religious tradition. Okay, hold on one second. I'm a Christian. I know Richard is ethnically Jewish. I don't know if he's a believing Jew or not, or if he's observant, or if he's reform, or whatever he is. I'm showing you Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments, and I'm honing in on this right here, verse 15, you shall not steal. In the King James Version, I was just showing you the New King James, but in the King James Version, which is the most popular version in the English language history, it reads like this: Thou shalt not steal. What is implied in that, folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, is private property. That command only makes sense if there is such a thing as private property. And private property is prior to the state. Okay, it's a natural right. Now, what in what sense do we mean prior? We mean that the rights of private property are rights that the state has an obligation to protect. Now, the positive law of the Constitution recognizes this in the takings clause. And what Richard, how so? It refers to just compensation. That means there's a standard of justice. The standard is justice. Well, how do we determine justice? It implies that there is a standard apart from the words of the Constitution, apart from the positive law. I think the most natural reading of that and the best explanation for there being such a standard a just compensation would be the natural rights tradition that Richard references there. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. I'm going to continue. All right. Yet the value of these rights in a state of nature is low. And I don't think you need to go to the state of nature stuff. I really don't, because I'm a Christian. Okay. And I believe that God created the world and there is purpose and meaning. There's a moral thickness to the metaphysics of the world. In other words, in reality, there's morality. That's the way it's created. Okay. And I don't even think you can understand don't steal without a, uh, some kind of thick principles that are part of reality, ultimately of right and wrong, pertaining to property. Now, we're going to maybe disagree with that if we have different religious traditions or different philosophical. If you're a naturalist, for example, like Thomas Nagel at NYU, where Richard is affiliated, we might have some agreement there. But Thomas Nagel is weird for a naturalist. For an atheist, he's weird. Most atheists in that tradition, the Anglo-analytic tradition in philosophy, I think are closer to like maybe Daniel Dennett than they are Michael Jubian or certainly someone like Thomas Nagel. Just read his book, The Last Word, pages 130 to 131. He indicates that a lot of his colleagues are saying, Tom, shut the hell up when you say that you want there to be a God and you don't think that you don't want there to be a God, but it doesn't look like you can get like ultimate meaning and value, including ethical and moral value, from a purely physical universe. And that's my position. I agree with that. I don't think God created a uh, purely physical universe. For more on that, see the episode that the Republican Professor podcast did with Professor Rob Coons of the University of Texas, or J.P. Moreland, for example. I could keep going, but I'm going to keep going with Richard here. Uncertainty and insecurity make it difficult to plan, which prevents individuals from effectively utilizing their talents and external goods. The question of governance is how the natural rights over labor and property can be preserved in form and enhanced in value by the exercise of political power, defined by Locke to be a right of making laws with penalties of death and consequently all less penalties for regulating and preserving of property and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws and in defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. What Richard is doing is he's laying out a normative theory of private property and the obligations government has under the takings clause. In other words, situations that the clause reaches, okay, and he uses this as a measuring rod, as it were, to evaluate how judicial actors have fared. And he concludes quite often the judicial actors have failed to protect the right of private property that are in cases that are reached by our Constitution, the takings clause, and in some cases, the contracts clause. Let me tell you about how this book came on my radar, if you're interested. And if you're not interested, I'm going to tell you anyway. This book came on my radar because um, I'm interested in property rights generally, but I'm especially interested in property rights that are not protected adequately by the Constitution, by by the guardians of the Constitution, I should say. And so I I began researching this, and I had a great mentor, Michael Uhlman, who was my constitutional law professor at Claremont Colleges. Um, and what I like about Richard is he has the same sensibilities as I do on these topics. He's not afraid to totally lambaste the judiciary for its failing in protecting property rights. Um, it's a recent example of someone who noted the failure of the judiciary in protecting property rights is senior judge Beebe on the Ninth Circuit. He was recently on a panel discussing judicial activism, I believe, for the Federalist Society. And at the end of that, he mentions 10 constitutional issues that Republicans would like to overturn, problems in the tradition, in the precedent. And then he mentions 10 cases that Democrats would like to overturn. And they are, if you're tempted to say these parties are the same, I don't know what kind of crack you're smoking, because they could not be further apart, these two positions. And one of the, oh, actually, I would say two of the cases he presents are the takings clause and the contract clause that Republicans would love to see overturned, bad precedent overturned. And I think a lot of that comes from Richard Epstein's work on that. Let me pause and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. My name's Sharon. Feel free to call me Sharon. It's called Changes in the Role of Judicial Restraint versus Activism. And I was watching this last Thursday. So I'm going to click a little wiki on this. And now, let me stop sharing really quick, and I'm going to take. I'm going to just play for you, Judge Beebe. I want you to see him.
With just occasional vacancies that did get filled.
I think he talks about it at around the hour mark.
Of you that listen to advisory.
Hold on a sec. Hold on one sec.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'm about to play you part of this video, just a short clip from Judge Beebe. This is published by the Federalist Society, and I want to thank them for allowing me to use this clip here. The Ninth Circuit, Senior Judge Beebe, I think he was appointed by George W. Bush. He's retired now. He's got senior status. Also on this panel is Mr. Luther, who worked in the first Trump term with Don McGahn, getting these judicial nominees through the Senate. And someone we featured on the podcast last week, which is Judge Bumate. His dissent in Duncan versus Bonta is fantastic. We're still going through that. He's the moderator. But Beebe is the one that's talking. His last name is Bybee, I think. I think it's pronounced Beebe, but he's a Mormon, I think, BYU guy, pretty sharp judge, and he's going through his list of 10 cases that Republicans would love to see overturned, problems in the precedent. He's just mentioned Humphrey's executor as the first one, and that relates to what we're talking about with Chevron and the removal power. Basically, unitary executive stuff, the power to fires, the power to control, power to move is power to control, and next he's going to mention the takings clause, the precedent, the problem precedent there. So let's take a look. Okay.
And make them single-headed agencies or fold them into existing executive agencies. A second one that...
Okay, this is Judge Bumate, who we started covering his dissent in Duncan versus Bonta. Excellent judge there, appointed by President Trump. Here's Adam Feldman, an empirical guy. This is Robert Luther, the guy I was talking to you about, who worked with Don McGahn. I think he teaches at George Mason now, law, but he worked with Don McGahn getting through Trump's appointments and getting the right nominees during his first term to the judiciary. This guy, Jay Beebe or Bybee, I think it's Beebe, is the one talking. He's the senior judge, Ninth Circuit. So let's hear what he's going to say. The second most important Republican priority should be or is. I think he's actually being descriptive, not normative. He's saying what it is for Republicans to overturn in terms of precedent.
What the court didn't take up this last week would be Kelo. That's the takings clause. This would be a much more modest change, but it certainly is one that conservatives would like to have in their sights. The big one on this list, the one that...
Okay, so did you hear what he said? He said the takings clause. That was the number 2 thing he mentioned.
Academics on both sides of the aisle often regard as deeply infirm would be slaughterhouse.
Okay, that's number 3. Let's fast forward. He has a lot to say about slaughterhouse.
Privileges or immunities clause. There are a lot of consequences that would follow from that.
Sure.
It would, for example, the contracts clause was the most moratorium case on my list is Blaisdell, 14th Amendment.
All right, so here's number 4. Ready?
The fourth case on my list is Blaisdell. That's the Minnesota mortgage moratorium case from the Great Depression era. The contracts clause was the most litigated provision of the 19th century, and the court really read it out. As Justice Sutherland points out in his dissent, he's clearly right. The court just read the contracts clause out of the Constitution. It read it out of the Constitution, and then it took a clause that applied to the states and applied it, reverse incorporated it against the federal government. So if the court were to overrule Blaisdell, it would have 2 consequences. 1, it would reinvigorate a contracts clause against the states, and 2, the court would have to revisit whether there are any principles that constrain the federal government. So it works on both sides.
Okay. So do you see, you see within the top 5, okay, within the top 5, guys, within the top 5, I want you to see the source on this. Hold on a sec. This is 6 days ago, so let's get the date on there. April 16th, 2025, Federalist Society. Changes in the role of the judiciary, restraint versus activism. April 16th, 2025. I want you to be able to find that and watch that. And we were at, what was the minute count? I think it was it's between minute 45 and minute 50. We're at minute 47:37 right there. Okay. Always cite your sources. Always cite your sources. So, this is a senior judge, and he's saying the contracts clause was totally, actually, he did use normative language there. He said they got it wrong in Blaisdell during the New Deal. And Sutherland's dissent, he said, was correct. Sutherland was the Republican who wrote in dissent. Sutherland was a Republican. Everybody knows that. Sutherland got it right, trying to protect the contract clause. So Richard Epstein is all over it here, criticizing the New Deal, criticizing the takings clause jurisprudence that gets it wrong, criticizing the contract jurisprudence that gets it wrong. And so I just want to point to you that there's a moment, a momentum here, I think, that might be building here. And let's continue here with our reading from Richard Epstein's book, Takings. Now, he's referring to some pie charts here. And I'm going to skip away from these pie charts because I don't know how helpful this part will be for you. The implicit normative limit, I'm on page 4, upon the use of political power is that it should preserve the relative entitlements among the members of the group, both in the formation of the social order and in its ongoing operation. All government action must be justified as moving a society from the smaller to the larger pie. I'll show you just briefly. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, obviously this isn't going to do much good for you, but these two pies allow us to isolate all the elements that surround both the origin of the state and the operation of the takings clause. The boundaries of the slices in the first pie are the limits of the private rights to be protected by the state. They identify the private property that cannot be taken without just compensation. I don't know if that helps, but in class we would go through this carefully. To achieve this end, a police power must be vested in the sovereign to prevent the private violation of the boundaries so defined. We now have the inherent power of all government, but it must be limited in the ends that will be served and in the means chosen to serve them. The formation and operation of the state, moreover, requires transferring resources from private to public hands. Private property must be converted to public use. Yet the power in the state to take for public use arises because the state will not obtain the resources needed to operate by voluntary donation or exchanges. If these sources of revenue and power were sufficient, then the state would raise no problem that a system of ordinary markets could not solve. But these exchanges do not occur voluntarily and must therefore be coerced. It becomes critical to regulate the terms on which the exchanges take place. The requirement of just compensation assures that the state will give to each person a fair equivalent to what has been taken. That is, area A in the second pie equals area A in the first. And so forth. Finally, the public use requirement conditions in the use of coercive power by demanding that any surplus generated by the action here, the outer ring, is divided among individuals in accordance with the size of their original contributions. Each gain from public action, therefore, is uniquely assigned to some individual, so that none is left to the state, transcending its citizens. In essence, the entire system of governance presupposes that in a state of nature there are two and only two failures of the system of private rights. The first is the inability to control private aggression, to which the police power is the proper response. The second is that voluntary transactions cannot generate the centralized power needed to combat private aggression. We only have another page, so hang with me here. There are transaction costs, holdout, and free-to-rider problems that are almost insuperable when the conduct of a large number of individuals must be organized. To this problem, the proper response is the power to force exchanges upon payment for public use. The eminent domain solution shows how a government can be organized to overcome the twin problems of aggression and provision of public goods. See how simple and clean this is? As these two problems are the only ones that call forth the state, so they define the limits to which the state may direct its monopoly of force. See, he's very concerned about emphasizing that the state has limits and requirements for justification, not just any old justification, not just nose counting and, oh, we got more than a majority. No. Moral justification, normative justification that doesn't depend on public opinion necessarily. That's my interpretation of what he's saying. Maybe he would say something different. I don't know. He'd probably couch it differently. The theory that justifies the formation of the state also demarcates the proper ends it serves. The simple structure of the two pies presupposes that we have a very clear sense of what counts as individual rights and why government is called upon to protect them. It sounds like the Declaration of Independence to me, doesn't it, to you? Thus, the political tradition in which I operate and to which the Takings Clause itself is bound rests upon a theory of natural rights. This is on page 5, the lowest paragraph. That theory does not presuppose the divine origin of personal rights and is consistent, I believe, with both libertarian and utilitarian justification of individual rights, which properly understood tend to converge in most important cases. Now, I would say that the divine origin of rights makes it much stronger and protects against criticisms of utilitarianism, the weaknesses that utilitarianism brings to the table there. But we're going to forgive him of that. Let's keep going. Whatever their differences at the core, all theories of natural rights reject the idea that private property and personal liberty are solely the creations of the state. He nailed it on the head right there. He nailed it on the head. Which itself is only other people given extraordinary powers. That sounds very biblical to me. Quite the opposite. A natural rights theory asserts that the end of the state is to prevent liberty and property. To protect, let me correct myself, take my foot out of my mouth, to protect liberty and property, as these conceptions are understood independent of and prior to the formation of the state. No rights are justified in a normative way simply because the state chooses to protect them as a matter of grace. May it please the Crown, protect my property, please. Protect my 10-round magazines, please. My 11-round magazines. That's a takings issue. You know, the 11-round magazine thing that we were talking about last week? That's a takings issue. But of course, who wants just compensation? I want just compensation. I mean, people don't want just compensation. They don't want to be disarmed and be given money. You know, I mean, we want the Second Amendment is probably best. Those kind of actions are best taken under the Second Amendment rather than the takings clause. But there is a takings issue there. I would say. But yeah, I mean, if it was just a takings issue, then the state could disarm you provided they paid you enough. And I think that we don't want that result. So what we want is, although a state that's willing to do that would probably not disarm you, but thank God for the Second Amendment. Okay, let's keep going here. Quite the opposite, a natural rights theory asserts that the end of the state is to protect liberty and property, as these concepts are understood independent of and prior to the formation of the state. No rights are justified in a normative way simply because the state chooses to protect them, a matter of grace. To use a common example of personal liberty, the state should prohibit murder because it is wrong. Murder is not wrong because the state prohibits it. I'm on page 6 at the top. The same applies to property. Trespass is not wrong because the state prohibits it. It is wrong because individuals own private property. Go back to the Ten Commandments here. Let's go back to the Ten Commandments. What in the world? Let's go back to those 10 commandments. Remember the 10 commandments? Do you remember? Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not steal. That presupposes there's obligations on the state. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not steal. What a concept. What a concept. Thou shalt not steal. Just think about that. What would there be to steal if there was no private property? The same applies to property. Trespass is not wrong because the state prohibits it. It is wrong because individuals own private property. At each critical juncture, therefore, independent rules, typically the rules of acquisition, protection, and disposition, specify how property is acquired and what rights its acquisition entails. Hence the contract clause connection. None of these rules rests entitlements on the state, which only enforces the rights and obligations generated by theories of private entitlement. The next chapter is chapter 2, Hobbesian Man, Lockean World. We're going to be talking about that maybe next time. I did want to say a bit more about the dissent that we were going over in the magazine case. And I think it's important to do a bit more work on the magazine case. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let's find the slip opinion. Okay, we were on page 80 of the slip opinion in Duncan versus Bonta. We're going to continue. Roman numeral 1, Second Amendment framework. This is Judge Bumate's dissent in Duncan versus Bonta, 20 March 2025. The Second Amendment commands, it's called the Second Amendment framework, Roman numeral 1. The Second Amendment commands that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This right flows from the inherent right of self-defense, as Blackstone said. It was central to the natural right of self-preservation. Notice a theme here. Notice there's a theme of the natural rights tradition. That is to say, there's limitations on the state. The state can't just do whatever it wants to do and call it a day and say, hey, no, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no normative criticism that would be successful ultimately on this. So let's keep going. Bumate. So there's a natural right of self-preservation and self-defense that Heller quotes, citing Blackstone. Though the Second Amendment guarantees a pre-existing right, it took until Heller for the Supreme Court to recognize its rightful place as a fundamental protection of liberty. In Heller, the Supreme Court examined the amendment's text and history and concluded that it conferred an individual right to keep and bear arms. I would say it protected an individual right. Though not unlimited, at its core, the Second Amendment protects the right of law-abiding citizens to keep and carry arms for the lawful purpose of self-defense. This guarantee is at its strongest when arms are used in defense of hearth and home, and because the right is so deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, it is fully applicable to the states under the 14th Amendment, citing McDonald, page 768. Repeatedly, the court has rejected freestanding interest balancing to resolve the Second Amendment questions. The court has rejected freestanding interest balancing in Second Amendment contexts. Okay. Despite the court's clear teaching, in Heller's wake, many courts, including our own, created two-step interest balancing tests that inevitably stripped away Second Amendment rights. As we've said, this two-step approach proved to be mere window dressing for the judicial policy making. At least in our court, no state regulation has ever been ruled unconstitutional before Bruin, page 82. Then came Bruin. Having had enough of the balancing, Bruin established a new framework, one consistent with the text of the Constitution. Bruin expressly declared that the Constitution demands that we jettison the use of interest balancing. Instead, it returned us to the Second Amendment's text and historical understanding. First, we look to the Second Amendment's textual elements. Does the Second Amendment's plain text cover an individual's conduct? If so, the Constitution presumptively protects that conduct. Second, to rebut that presumption, the government, let me say this again, the government bears the burden of justifying its regulation. This is the sea change right here that Judge Boudemé is referring to in Second Amendment jurisprudence as a result of these lines of cases from the Supreme Court. I want to point out that although Richard is wrong on some Second Amendment stuff, and I'm not going to open that can of worms, okay? Don't worry. He's okay. He's a great guy. He's a little bit squirrely on this, on the Second Amendment stuff. But his stuff on takings and the contract stuff, guys, he's on our side. Richard Epstein is great. And I want to show you that anytime you get a textbook that is focused on limited government, where the government must justify its intrusion on individual liberty, you want to make friends with that textbook. You want to make friends with that author. You want to get to know that stuff well if it's done well. And of course, Judge Boudemé is at the height of his game here, and Richard Epstein is at the height of his game as well. Put simply, the government must affirmatively prove, this is Judge Boudemé again, dissent Duncan versus Bonta, March 2025, Ninth Circuit, en banc. Put simply, the government must affirmatively prove that its firearm regulation is part of the historical tradition that delimits the outer bounds of the right to keep and bear arms. If the government fails to do this, the regulation does not pass constitutional muster, does not pass. How do we know if a regulation fits in the historical tradition? Like judges do in every case, we use analogical reasoning. But rather than ask how other federal judges have conducted the interest balancing calculus, we apply the balance struck by the founding generation to the modern circumstances. That means the government must identify a well-established and representative historical analog, and our task is to decide whether the regulation and historical analogs are relevantly similar. Of course, this analogical reasoning is neither a regulatory straitjacket nor a regulatory blank check. Some regulations will stand, some will fall. But the key is finding a relevantly similar historical analog. Analogs need not be twins or dead ringers. Instead, Bruin tells us that our central consideration is whether the modern regulation imposes a comparable burden on the right of armed self-defense and whether that burden is comparably justified. In other words, we must compare the how and the why of the government's regulation with the reported historical analog. In this way, the only means ends scrutiny involved is the interest balancing by the people who ratified the Second Amendment. Wow, this is so good. One more paragraph, okay? And then we'll be done. In conducting this inquiry, we shouldn't be overly rigid. We don't have to look for a law trapped in amber. That's quoting Rahimi at 691. Instead, we look to whether the challenge regulation is consistent with the principles that underpin our regulatory tradition. So what's required is that the modern regulation works in the same way and does so for the same reasons as historical regulations. Doing this faithfully may reveal guiding principles defining the scope of the right. At the same time, we must also be careful not to read a principle at such a high level of generality that it waters down the right. After all, extracting principles too far removed from the historical record just returns us to the interest balancing regime that the court has authoritatively repudiated, and history, not policy, is the proper guide. We're on page 84 now of the Ninth Circuit uscourts.gov version, the PDF of Duncan versus Bonta. That's published on March 23rd, 2025. And we've been reading a little bit from Takings, a transformative fair use of takings, private property, and the power of eminent domain by Richard A. Epstein, Harvard University Press. It's the 40th anniversary. It was published 1985, 40 years ago. We'd like to celebrate the 40th anniversary of this book, Takings by Richard A. Epstein, Private Property and the Power of Eminent Domain, where he lays out the groundwork of what justifies eminent domain, and that, of course, shows clearly that the government, in terms of the judiciary, especially, has failed to protect the cases, the parties in the cases that are harmed, where those cases are reached by that clause in the Constitution. And of course, the magazine ban, so-called magazine ban, is really a dispossession and it creates criminals where none existed, and it's a taking. It's a taking of private property without just compensation. In fact, not only is it not just compensation, it's unjust compensation because it imputes criminality to an innocent person, which I think is one of the most important, the most harmful and immoral and evil things that a government can do. All tyrannies do this. All horrible governments do exactly that. They impute criminality to the innocent, and they make innocent conduct criminal. And so Richard, in this book, Takings, Private Property and the Power of Eminent Domain, published by Harvard University Press, 1985, 40 years ago, seeks to provide a comprehensive theory applied to specific cases and elucidating specific cases in the precedent. Now, this is as of 40 years ago, so it's not updated, but as of 40 years ago, where you would have something to stand on to create a culture in electoral politics that elects the right kind of senators and presidents, that put the right kind of judges on the judiciary to correct these problems, where we go back to the Constitution that is, of course, eminently well justified and provides a better condition of human flourishing than what we have today. So thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast here on 22 April 2025. It's a Tuesday. It's still Easter in the correct tradition. And I'm Dr. Lucas J. Mather, your host. We'll see you next time.